Hi everyone, and welcome back to another video, or welcome if you are new to my channel. I say welcome to another video, but it's not really. I have decided to do the staircase again, but this time with just my pure whispers, because my last video obviously had mic brushing involved, and whilst a lot of people did like it, there were many that either don't like mic brushing at all or like it but it was a bit too loud, which when I listened to it back with headphones in, I completely understand what you're saying, and I wanted to film this case again without anything else, just me whispering, so that those of you who couldn't watch the last video can still enjoy the case, because it's an interesting one. I don't want anybody to miss out on this story if they were interested to hear it. So let's recover the staircase, which is known by this due to the Netflix documentary of the same name. And that documentary is very long. It's maybe 11 or 12 episodes long, and I watched it when it first came out a few years back, but I did not rewatch it in order to do this video because it's just so long, and it's actually unreasonably long. It doesn't need to be as long as it is. It kind of waffles on, and it's not even fully comprehensive, which you would think, considering how long it is, it would have absolutely every detail that you would need, but it doesn't, and it's quite biased, but we'll get to that later. So the staircase is about the death of Kathleen Peterson. She was born Kathleen Hunt on February 21st, 1959 in Greensboro, North Carolina, and Kathleen was very intelligent. She graduated at the top of her class at J.B. McCaskey High School in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which consisted of 473 students. She was also the first woman to ever be accepted into the School of Engineering at Duke University, where she earned a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering and a Master's in Mechanical Engineering. After this, she went on to work at pharmaceutical and IT companies in high-level executive positions. And Kathleen was very well liked. She was a big member of her community. She served on the board of the Durham Arts Council, where she received multiple awards for her leadership skills. She was also a very generous philanthropist. In 1977, Kathleen married her first husband, Fred Atwater, and they ended up having a daughter together named Caitlin. But after 10 years, their marriage just wasn't working anymore, so they decided to part ways and get a divorce in 1985. Not too long after, Kathleen was introduced to someone new, a dad from her daughter's school called Michael Peterson. So now that we've met Michael, let's dive into his background. He was born Michael Ivor Peterson on October 23rd, 1943, near Nashville, Tennessee. He also went to Duke University and graduated with a degree in political science, after which he went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he took some law school classes. After college, Michael got a job as an analyst for the Department of Defense, where he spent most of his time researching justifications for the US military involvement in Vietnam. In 1965, Michael met his first wife, Patricia, and a few years after they got married, he joined the Marine Corps and went and served in Vietnam. But it didn't last very long because he ended up getting discharged after sustaining an injury during a car accident. The injury was pretty bad. disabled. After this, he and his wife moved to Germany, where they had 2 sons, Clayton and Todd. Patricia worked as an elementary school teacher at the military base, and whilst working there, she met Elizabeth Ratliff, and they became fast friends, like best friends. And Elizabeth had a husband named George and 2 children, Margaret and Martha. And the 2 families got along really well and would spend a lot of time together. George was also a captain in the military, so he and Michael had a lot to bond over and talk about, and they really liked each other. But unfortunately, George suddenly passed away in 1983 of a heart attack during the US invasion of Grenada, and this was very shocking to his family. It was a huge loss for them. So the Petersons really stepped up as friends and tried to be there for them as much as they could to help them get through this really horrible time in their lives. And Michael really took it upon himself to try and be like a father figure to the daughters that George had left behind, Margaret and Martha. And as I mentioned, the 2 families were super close, so Elizabeth had no problem with him doing this. In fact, she was very grateful for him stepping in and helping her family to grieve and try to move on with their lives. But then, just as Margaret and Martha were starting to get used to their life without their dad, their mother Elizabeth suddenly passes away in 1985, just 2 years after losing their dad. The medical examiner determined that Elizabeth died from an intracerebral hemorrhage, secondary to von Willebrand's disease, which is a blood clotting disease that she suffered from. And as you can imagine, the girls were absolutely devastated. They'd lost both their parents within a couple of years of each other, and they had no idea what their future was going to look like now. Elizabeth's body was brought back to the United States and buried in Bay City, Texas. So now Margaret and Martha are orphans, so Michael Peterson became their legal guardian. And it was soon after this that Michael's marriage with Patricia started going downhill, and they ended up getting divorced in 1986. At which point he ended up moving back to the States with Margaret and Martha, leaving his sons to live with Patricia in Germany. Once back in North Carolina, he formally adopted the girls, so he's now their official parent. And then eventually both his sons actually came back to live with him as well, so there ended up being the 4 kids and Michael living together in the States. Michael started working as a columnist for the local Durham Herald-Sun newspaper, where he became known for criticizing the police department and the district attorney. He also spent time writing about his experience in the military, and he actually wrote multiple military-related novels, and reportedly did quite well as a writer. Apparently he got a $500,000 advance for one of his books, and a Hollywood production company expressed interest in making one of them into a movie, but it actually never ended up happening. So in 1986, Margaret and Martha made a new friend at school named Caitlin Atwater, and they introduced Michael to Caitlin's mum, Kathleen. So now that we're back at the moment in the story where Kathleen and Michael meet, and they hit it off instantly and start dating. In 1989, they asked all the kids how they would feel about them all moving in together. And the girls were actually really happy about it because they were having one of their best friends move in with them, and they referred to it as being like a permanent sleepover. In 1996, Michael and Kathleen got married and raised their family in a 9,000 square foot mansion in the Forest Hills neighborhood of Durham, North Carolina. Michael and Kathleen were said to have had a fairy tale romance. They were madly in love and completely devoted to their new family that they had managed to just seamlessly blend together. Everyone got along well, and it just seemed to work out perfectly. stairs. But that all changed on December 9th, 2001. At around 2:40 a.m, 911 received a call from Michael saying that he had found Kathleen at the bottom of their back staircase. He sounded panicked and was saying that she'd fallen down the stairs and that they needed to come right away. The dispatcher asked how many stairs she had fallen down, and he estimated about 15 to 20. Michael's son Todd was over at a friend's house, so Michael called him and told him what had happened, and he came back to the house before the ambulance got there. When first responders got to the house, they were shocked at the amount of blood at the scene for a fall down the stairs, because there was a lot of it. So, as I mentioned, Kathleen was found at the bottom of the back staircase. So they had two staircases in their home, and this one was located towards the back of the house. And it was very narrow and enclosed in comparison to like your normal average staircase. So it wasn't like the main one of the house, but like a smaller one towards the back, more enclosed. And in the footage, it looks like this staircase is wooden. I don't remember seeing any carpet or anything to soften the blow of falling down the stairs, but even so, the amount of blood that was at the scene was just quite shocking for someone falling down the stairs. Kathleen was found with her head on the last step and her legs splayed out in front of her going into the hallway, so she was no longer in the staircase, just her head was on the stairs and the rest of her body was laying in the hall. But there was blood all over the walls of the staircase, all the way down to where she was at the bottom, including on the stairs, on the face plates of the stairs, and a pool of blood at the bottom. There was also a tremendous amount of blood on her clothing, so it really was everywhere. Kathleen got rushed to hospital, but unfortunately it was too late. She had died from her injuries at only 48 years old, and straight away this whole scenario of a woman taking such a brutal tumble down the stairs that it kills her seems unbelievable. And with the amount of blood, it just seemed like it was all too much to only be generated from falling down the stairs. So how did this happen? Michael said it was a perfectly normal day. He and Kathleen had watched a movie that night, America's Sweethearts. Then afterwards, they went outside and relaxed by the pool with some drinks and just chatted late into the evening. Eventually, Kathleen decided to go back into the house, and Michael stayed out by the pool smoking his pipe. He then goes into the house at around 2:40 a.m. and finds Kathleen at the bottom of the stairs. He said he immediately assumed that she had fallen down them and called 911 right away. Investigators found a bottle of wine and 2 wine glasses in the garden, so that corroborates Michael's story that they were drinking and hanging out back there, but they just couldn't get past the sheer amount of blood that was at the scene. It was way more than you would expect from a fall down the stairs. And as the police gathered more information from Michael about what happened that night, the more they started to question his story. So evidence was collected and a case was starting to be built against Michael. On December 20th, 2001, they finally had enough evidence to charge Michael Peterson with Kathleen's murder. And this shocked everyone. The family were adamant that he would never do something like this and refused to believe it to be true. And their friends and neighbours all thought Michael was a great guy and that him and Kathleen were a beautiful couple and that there's just no way that he would have harmed her. Michael was also shocked at being arrested. He said he never dreamed anyone would think that he would kill his wife. After a month in prison, Michael was released on an $850,000 bond, and and he also had to give up a lot of his possessions, so his wallet, his car, his passport, and he wasn't allowed to travel anywhere, not even leave the state. And this is when Michael spoke publicly for the first time, saying, "Kathleen was my life. I whispered her name in my heart 1,000 times. She is there, but I can't stop crying. I would never have done anything to hurt her. I am innocent of these charges, and we will prove it in court." In the footage of his speech, he does appear quite dishevelled, very upset, and the public were really torn on what to think about this situation, because he has a really good reputation with all the locals. You know, they all really like him and just only know him to be a good guy. So most people believed he was innocent, and they still do to this day. Jury selection started in May of 2003, and the trial was set to begin in July. In the lead up to the trial, Michael's friends and family really stood up for him, publicly stating their support for him, including his adoptive daughters. They truly believed he was innocent. And so did his ex-wife Patricia, who actually became good friends with Kathleen, so he was on really good terms with his ex-wife. Patricia didn't think there was any way that Michael would have done this. She said she knew Michael was innocent, that he would never hurt Kathleen because he just wasn't violent like that. She said he truly loved her, and that they would have stayed together forever if she hadn't passed away. Michael also repeatedly insisted his innocence and said that he would never have wanted to end Kathleen's life, that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. And he continually talked about the great times that they'd had together over the past 14 years. So, Michael was represented by Charlotte attorney David Rudolph. Now, David decided that they were going to argue that Kathleen had mixed alcohol and Valium together, the prescription drug Valium that helps with anxiety and sleep, which, when taken together, would have made her very dizzy and disorientated, and that as she was trying to walk up the stairs that were narrow and dark in a pair of flip-flops, it would have been easy for her to fall. What shocked a lot of people is that she fell walking up the stairs, because naturally I think you would assume that if you had heard that someone had taken such a bad tumble down the stairs that they died, you would think they were coming down and that they would have fallen from basically the very top. But Kathleen actually fell going up the stairs, and apparently only a few steps up as well. But they argued that she fell several times. So after the first fall, she struggled to get up and then fell again. And they said that she may have even fallen more than that, trying to get up several times, falling again, slipping, and hitting her head over and over, which caused her death. They claimed that falls can happen in a million different ways and with a million different variations. And they said that their experts would explain that the injuries on Kathleen's body are consistent with this fall. Now, I don't know about you, but I was thinking, if this was me and I fell down the stairs that made me hurt my head really badly, I don't think I would be attempting to go back up the stairs. If it's hurting that bad, I'd probably go back to my husband and be like, "I've really hurt my head." Unless maybe it wasn't bleeding and I just kind of thought, well, I'll be fine, and then I go up a second time. But if I fall a second time and hit my head again, I mean, even if it's not bleeding at this point, I'm gonna go to my husband and be like, "Oh, my head's hurting, I should probably sit down for a minute." But if it is bleeding, I'm definitely not going to try going up the stairs again, because there's probably blood on the floor that's making it slippery. Like, I just don't see someone repeatedly trying to go up the stairs once they've really badly hurt their head and there's potentially blood on the floor. It just doesn't really make sense to me, personally. The defense brought in a man named Henry Lee to assist in their case. He's a blood spatter analyst and forensic expert. concluded that Kathleen's injuries were the result of a tragic accidental fall, and the volume of blood at the scene was irrelevant. He said that she was bleeding profusely from the injuries on her head and coughing up blood at the same time. Now, Henry Lee was quite controversial because in court he did something a bit weird. He brought out ketchup, put it in his mouth and spat it out onto a bit of paper to try and show what the blood spatter would look like if you were coughing up blood. And a lot of people didn't like this. They thought it was disrespectful and not a real scientific method for a court case. So the prosecution completely disagreed with this. Kathleen's injuries make everything even more confusing, because she had multiple head lacerations that looked as if either someone had hit her over the head with an object, or she'd been scratched by something or someone, but she had no bruises on her arms or legs, which I would have thought you would definitely have bruises from falling down the stairs. Michael kept pushing the idea that Kathleen was drinking a lot that night, but when they did a blood alcohol test on her, it came back at 0.07% blood alcohol level, and you're still allowed to drive until you hit 0.08%, so she definitely wasn't drunk. The autopsy report showed that she had about 6 or 7 deep lacerations on the top and back of her head, which were likely caused by repeated blows from a light, rigid object. She also had a fracture of the thyroid neck cartilage, which indicates an intense amount of pressure on the neck, possibly from strangulation. Another thing to note is that when first responders got to the scene, most of the blood around Kathleen had already dried, meaning she was probably laying there for quite some time. The neurons in her brain showed that she was alive and unconscious for at least 90 minutes, and possibly up to 2 hours, before she actually died. And the medical examiner, Deborah Radish, actually ended up ruling Kathleen's death as a homicide, stating, "At the end of the autopsy examination, taking into account the number of scalp lacerations, their locations, their orientation, together with the neck injury, the findings were unequivocal that it was not from a fall down the stairs." So the fact that she was found at the bottom of the stairs indicates that either an incident happened on the stairs, or perhaps she had been placed there to make it look like she had fallen. The prosecution presented the idea that a blowpoke for a fireplace could have been what was used to hit her and cause these lacerations. If you aren't aware, a blowpoke is what you use to stoke a fire, but it's hollow because you can also blow down it to fan the flames. And it turns out that the couple owned a custom, very nice blowpoke that was a gift from Kathleen's sister, and it sat next to their fireplace, and funnily enough, it was missing from their home. But the defense argued that since there was no skull fracture found in the autopsy, there was no way that she could have died from being beaten to death. One of the prosecution's primary goals was to establish that Michael was a liar in order to hurt his credibility with the jury. And it turns out he was. Michael had actually lied about his military accomplishments. Years earlier, Michael had run for mayor, and whilst he was running, he said that he was awarded 2 Purple Hearts, one of them for being hit by shrapnel from a landmine explosion in Vietnam. But as it turns out, he made that all up. According to military records, he had been awarded a Silver Star and a Bronze Medal with Valor, but no Purple Hearts. And as I mentioned earlier, his injury causing him to leave the military was from a car accident, not shrapnel. So they proved that Michael was able to lie about pretty big things. And Michael even admitted in court that sometimes he lied because it made things easier, saying it was just easier sometimes to let the lie come out. So now the prosecution needed to show that Michael had lied the staircase was from someone bludgeoning Kathleen to death, lifting up the murder weapon over and over again, flinging blood around the walls and coming into contact with the walls as well, not from coughing up blood. And the stains on her pants were consistent with impact splatter, as the result of a forceful impact, and that the person wearing those pants at the time of the impact was in close proximity to the source of blood. So now they need to show motive, and this is where they dropped a pretty big bombshell in court. They had evidence that Michael was bisexual and was having an affair with another man. Investigators discovered over 2,000 photos of men on his computer, and they also found a conversation between Michael and a 26-year-old male escort named Brent Walgamont, who they actually brought into court to testify. They asked Brent what types of services he performed, and he responded saying companionship for other males of legal age. When asked if that sometimes involved sexual activity, he said yes, sometimes it does. And it turns out that Michael and Brent had been talking for at least 4 months prior to Kathleen's death. As far as we know, it was all online, but they did have plans to meet up in person fairly soon. Now, the night Kathleen died, she asked Michael if she could use his computer to prep for a conference call the next day. So they theorized that Kathleen may have come across these images, and not only that, but Michael had printed out pages of conversations with this escort and put them in his desk drawer, where they were talking about where they planned to meet and what kind of sexual acts they were going to do. So they presented the idea that Kathleen discovered Michael was cheating on her, confronted him about it, and they got into a fight, and maybe this fight got violent. Maybe Michael beat Kathleen to death and then staged it to look like she fell down the stairs. One of the district attorneys on the prosecution, Frida Black, really tried to emphasize his sexuality during the case, making it a really big deal and that he had a secret side to himself. But Michael claimed that Kathleen was aware that he was bisexual and that she was fine with it. But even if she is fine with it, I wonder if she's fine with him hooking up with a male escort. That could be a different matter altogether. But the defense argued that if he was trying to hide this part of him, why would he print out conversations and leave them in the desk, or even let her use his computer at all, risking her finding everything? The next motive investigators focused on was money, and this is where things start to get pretty complicated. It was revealed that the couple were in roughly $143,000 worth of debt and were heading towards serious financial instability. They were essentially surviving from month to month using credit cards. Kathleen was close to losing her job, and these financial pressures were believed to have caused significant strain inside the home. At the time, Kathleen earned $145,000 a year, but that year she had deferred a large portion of her salary, and her company was actively laying off employees. Meanwhile, Michael hadn't had a reliable source of income for several years. His writing career never reached the level of success that he'd hoped for. And on top of that, it came out that Michael's sons were also deeply in debt. Investigators uncovered emails between Michael and Patricia discussing their son's financial problems, and in one of those messages, Michael specifically said that he needed to keep the situation hidden from Kathleen. As expected, attention then turned to Kathleen's life insurance policy. The payout Michael Peterson stood to receive in the event of Kathleen's death totaled $1,834,166. However, in order to collect that money, Kathleen's death would need to be ruled as an accident. Prosecutors argued that Michael may have developed this idea years earlier, back when he was living in Germany with his first wife, and this where the case takes a dramatic turn. So when Michael was living in Germany with Patricia, they had that friend Elizabeth Ratliff, who died suddenly in 1985, and then the two daughters ended up moving in with him. Now Elizabeth had a sister named Margaret Blair, and when she learned that Michael's second wife Kathleen had died after falling down the stairs, she immediately contacted authorities. What concerned her was how similar Kathleen's death appeared to be to Elizabeth's. According to Margaret, Elizabeth and her daughters had dinner at the Peterson home that evening. Afterwards, Michael walked them home, and later that night, a neighbour reported seeing Michael running away from Elizabeth's house. The following morning, Elizabeth was discovered dead at the bottom of her staircase by the girl's nanny, Barbara, and in a position strikingly similar to how Kathleen was found. Even more unsettling, Elizabeth had lacerations on the back of her head that closely resembled Kathleen's injuries. In the weeks leading up to her death, Elizabeth had reportedly been suffering from severe headaches. Because of this, the medical examiner concluded that she had suffered an intracerebral hemorrhage, collapsed and fell down the stairs. German police and US military police both investigated her death at the time, and it was ruled a death from natural causes and an accident, not a homicide. However, something didn't add up. Official police reports noted very little blood at the scene, but Barbara the nanny, who found Elizabeth, told a very different story. She stated the blood was everywhere. She later described looking at the wall and seeing blood spatter reaching incredibly high. When asked how high, she explained that she was nearly 6 foot tall and the blood was higher than her outstretched arm. She couldn't understand how blood could have reached that height from a fall down the stairs. Barbara also recalled that Michael was coming and going from the house, interacting with military personnel. Michael told people that Elizabeth had suffered a brain aneurysm and fallen down the stairs. Another witness, a woman who helped clean the scene, testified that it took hours to remove all the blood from the staircase. When the Elizabeth Ratliff case resurfaced, it shocked everyone. Even friends and family began reconsidering their opinions because it seemed nearly impossible that one person could be connected to two nearly identical staircase deaths. Deaths caused by falling downstairs are rare, and having two linked to the same person was seen as a major turning point, and this was when public opinion shifted significantly. As a result, prosecutors decided to exhume Elizabeth Ratliff's body, and the autopsy was conducted by Deborah Radish, the same medical examiner who ruled Kathleen's death a homicide. Michael's attorney, David Rudolph, objected to Radish performing the autopsy and requested a Texas medical examiner instead, but that request was denied. After reviewing the findings, the updated autopsy concluded that Elizabeth's death was also a homicide. Radish testified that, in her opinion, the cause of Elizabeth's death was blunt force trauma to the head. Michael was never charged in connection with Elizabeth's death, but prosecutors used the case to suggest a possible pattern, implying that Michael may have committed a similar crime before and avoided consequences. The prosecution believed Michael may have killed Elizabeth, got away with it, and later used the same method to kill Kathleen. But despite multiple theories, prosecutors still lacked one crucial element: the murder weapon. They had proposed the use of the blowpoke that was missing from the home, and during the trial, the defense suddenly produced this blowpoke. Michael's son claimed he found it in the garage, an area that the police had searched multiple times. The blowpoke was covered in spider webs, raising questions about whether it had been placed there later. Forensic testing showed that it hadn't been used in years, well before Kathleen's death, meaning it couldn't be definitively used as the murder weapon. This severely weakened the prosecution's case. At the same time, the jury appeared unimpressed with the prosecution's conduct. They were criticised for behaving unprofessionally, sometimes even celebrating test results. After the blowpoke issue, the case against Michael seemed increasingly unstable. The jury was eventually taken to the Peterson home to view the staircase firsthand, as well as the pool area where Michael and Kathleen had been earlier in the evening. This helped them understand the layout and distances involved. The trial stretched on for 3 months, making it the longest trial in North Carolina history. During deliberations, the jury concluded that the blowpoke could not be proven as the murder weapon, and chose not to consider Elizabeth Ratliff's death, ruling it irrelevant. Ultimately, on October 10, 2003, Michael Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, with the jury determining the crime was premeditated, even if that only occurred mere seconds before the act. Michael and his daughters were devastated. In court, he whispered to them that he loved them and that he would be okay. Over the course of the trial, Michael had lost many supporters. Even Kathleen's daughter changed her stance after reviewing the autopsy photos, realizing that her injuries could not reasonably be explained by a fall down the stairs. Experts testified that parts of the blood appeared to have been wiped, as if someone had attempted to clean the scene and then stopped, and Michael was the only other person present. Kathleen's sister Candice also withdrew her support after learning more about Michael's bisexuality and the state of their marriage. Eventually, much of the family cut ties with him. But Michael continued to maintain his innocence and immediately began filing appeals. In 2006, a court-appointed attorney argued that Michael had not received a fair trial, citing judicial and prosecutorial errors. The appeal was denied, and the North Carolina Supreme Court upheld that decision in 2007. In 2008, Michael hired new attorneys who challenged the testimony of Dwayne Deaver, the SBI blood spatter analyst. And although the motion was denied in 2009, concerns about Deaver's qualifications gained traction. In 2010, the Attorney General launched an investigation and found that Deaver had misrepresented or withheld evidence in over 34 cases across 16 years, and he was fired in 2011. David Rudolph returned to represent Michael pro bono, believing him to be innocent. A judge ultimately ruled that Michael had not received a fair trial due to Deaver's misconduct and granted a new trial. Michael was released on December 16, 2011, on house arrest with $300,000 bail. A new trial was scheduled for May 2017, but it never occurred. Instead, Michael entered an Alford plea in February of 2017, which means that he's pleading guilty to voluntary manslaughter whilst also maintaining his innocence. He was sentenced to 86 months, but having already served 89 months, he was released immediately, and Michael remains a free man to this day. The documentary The Staircase, directed by Oscar winner Jean-Xavier de Lestrade, began filming within weeks of Kathleen's death, and although it was marketed as unbiased, many viewers believe it strongly favours Michael, a bias even acknowledged by the director. And it later emerged that the documentary's editor had a romantic relationship with Michael whilst he was in prison, and they eventually moved in with each other after his release. That's just crazy to me. No wonder the documentary is biased when the editor is dating the guy it's about. So even though this, there are still lots of theories about what really occurred that night, because he never admitted to what happened. He always maintains that he's innocent. So now we're going to cover some of the theories and maybe some of the information that wasn't spoken about during the trial or the documentary. So one significant legal development that often gets overlooked is that in October of 2002, Caitlin Atwater, Kathleen's daughter, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Michael. This civil case existed separately from the criminal trial. Michael later attempted to file for bankruptcy in 2006, but Kathleen's estate immediately objected. Ultimately, in February 2007, Michael agreed to a $25 million settlement, though he never admitted to killing Kathleen as part of that agreement. From a forensic standpoint, despite serious issues with the prosecution's expert testimony, particularly the blood spatter analyst, the physical evidence at the scene remains difficult to ignore. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence was the discovery of a bloody shoe print on Kathleen's sweatpants, and that print was later determined to be consistent with a pair of Michael's shoes. However, when paramedics arrived, Michael was barefoot, and his shoes and socks were found near Kathleen's body. This raised obvious questions about why he would have removed them and when exactly that had happened. A luminol test revealed bare footprints throughout the house and extending into the back garden. These footprints appeared to indicate that someone had been walking around after Kathleen was already heavily bleeding. Prosecutors suggested that this could mean Michael left her at the staircase and moved around the house, possibly in an attempt to stage the scene or try to clean up before calling 911. Adding to the confusion, investigators found blood droplets inside Michael's shorts, which he claimed must have transferred when he tried to help Kathleen. His clothing that night also raises eyebrows, because he was only wearing a t-shirt and shorts and no shoes, and yet they had been outside by the pool and it was only 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The missing blowpoke is yet another layer of controversy. While the defense argued that it couldn't have been the murder weapon because it was later found downstairs covered in spider webs, it's important to note that they never turned it over to police for proper evidence handling when it was supposedly found. Instead, it was dramatically introduced in court, meaning its evidentiary value was already compromised. To this day, there's no definitive proof that it wasn't used, only that it couldn't be conclusively proven that it was. Another unsettling detail is the behaviour of Michael's son, who was reportedly at the house before the ambulance arrived, but despite this, he refused to speak with police entirely and never gave a statement, which, whilst that's legally within his rights, that decision struck many people as highly unusual, and fueled speculation that he might have been either protecting his father or just knew more about what happened and wasn't willing to speak. People have also theorized that there could have been an intruder, but this is widely considered unlikely. Michael reported a burglary roughly 6 months before Kathleen's death, initially claiming his phone was stolen, but it later turned out to be his son's phone. He also claimed that there were several car break-ins in the neighbourhood around that time. The defence suggested that Michael's past as a journalist, critical of law enforcement, might have made him a target, but most people find this explanation unconvincing, given the lack of disturbance inside the home. There's also lingering frustration over the fact that Kathleen's clothing was never tested for third-party DNA, meaning investigators can't definitively rule out another person's involvement. This omission continues to bother many people who follow the case. And then the final theory is a little bit out there, the owl theory. Yes, One of their neighbours, T. Lawrence Pollard, who was known as Larry and was a lawyer, suggested that Kathleen was attacked by a barn owl outside, then ran into the house and fell on the staircase whilst trying to escape. He claims that there are lots of barn owls in the area and it's not uncommon for them to dive bomb people. So he really thought that this could have been what happened, and one of the reasons he thinks that is because the lacerations on her head look like they could be caused from talons, and apparently there were microscopic feathers found in her hair as well as a small sliver of wood. However, critics argue that owl-related fatalities are virtually unheard of, and that there was no clear evidence of an attack outside the home. Prosecutors and medical examiners dismissed the theory as implausible. But still, even David Rudolph, his old attorney, later acknowledged that the slip and fall explanation never fully made sense to him, and he eventually came to believe that owl theory was at least possible, but it was introduced too late to be presented at trial. But something that I thought of when I heard about this is that, as far as I'm aware, these microscopic feathers weren't ever determined to have come from an owl. So I wondered if maybe they came from like a down pillow or something like that during their fight. If they were fighting upstairs, perhaps she picked up a pillow and went to hit him with it or something like that, and it got ripped and a load of feathers came out. And if that's the case, it would explain why there's feathers in her hair. Also, if it's true that Michael attempted to clean the scene because of the smears of blood on the wall, but he gave up with that, maybe he did clean up all the other feathers, because evidently she was laying there for a good long while before he called anybody. And also, if she's been attacked by an owl outside, why did she not run to her husband instead of inside, where the owl could follow her and get stuck inside the house? And surely Michael would have at least heard her screaming if it happened in the garden, and would rush to help her if he couldn't see it. You know, he could have possibly even seen it if it was in the garden. And also, why did he not bring this up in court? There's no way that their garden is so big that if she starts getting attacked by an owl, which would make her scream, that he can't hear her. You'd have to be miles and miles away to not hear her scream. So I just don't believe that if that happened, he didn't know about it. But to this day, no one truly knows what happened to Kathleen, and it may remain unresolved forever. Even though there was some kind of conclusion, we just don't really know the events of that night. And it's a weird one. I'm not sure what I think. I think it's highly suspicious that Michael has been involved or connected to two women that have died by falling down the stairs. That's a big, big coincidence, and I know that coincidences happen because I've got someone in my life that's had some pretty crazy coincidences happen to them, but nothing like this. Like, you know, it's rare for people to die falling down the stairs, so to have two of them happen in your life, and it's not really that far away from each other, probably like 15 years or something, maybe less. I don't know, I just find that very, very suspicious. And also that at Elizabeth's death, it was marked down that there wasn't a lot of blood, and yet all the other witnesses said no, there was an obscene amount of blood. So that definitely makes me think that Michael had it. I don't know. The owl theory kind of makes sense if the lacerations on her head and she's got feathers in her hair. But I just don't see Michael